This week is Parshat Tetzaveh. And in many years, Purim will come out in Parshat Tetzaveh. Not always, but in many, many years, Tetzaveh will be either right before or right after Purim. This year we have a very special Purim. It's called Purim Mishulash. It's a triple Purim. Why? Is because Shushan Purim always follows the regular Purim. But this year, Shushan Purim turns out on Shabbat, and we don't celebrate Purim on Shabbat. So it's pushed off till Sunday. So that way, we begin celebrating Thursday night. The fast day is Thursday. We begin celebrating the whole world on Thursday night and Friday. Then it's Shabbos, and then on Sunday is Shushan Purim in Yerushalayim. So it's spread out over, it's really 4 days, but like technical 3 days, and it's called Purim Mishulash. So I just want to point out, this is not the main idea of this class, but I'm mentioning this so everyone, when you're hearing the Megillah, you can pay attention to the following. Parsha Tetzaveh, our Parsha, is mostly about the clothing of the Kohanim and of the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. And the end of the Parsha is more about the consecration of the Mikdash. But the whole first part of the Parsha is about the clothing of the Kohanim. So I just want everyone to notice that in the Megillah, how important clothing is to the whole story. I'm just going to run through this super fast. In the beginning, Vashti is killed because she's told to come to the feast without any clothing. And then when Mordechai finds out about the plans of Haman, so he takes off his clothes and he puts on clothes of mourning, sackcloth and ashes. And Esther, when she hears this, so she sends him clothing, saying it's not permitted to sit in the gate of the king in sackcloth and ashes. And he refused to take them. And then later, when Haman comes to Achashverosh with a request to hang Mordechai, but the king's sleep has been interrupted, and he reads the book of remembrances, and now he knows what Mordechai did for him, and he never rewarded him. So what did Haman have to do? He had to dress Mordechai in the clothing of a king and parade him through the street. And then later, when after Haman is hung, so it mentions how Mordechai is dressed in the clothing of of royalty. So clothing comes up over and over again. And I just want to mention that this whole parsha is about, the concept of enclosement, how clothes are a outside manifestation of something that's going on in the inside. Or in a different way, the world is the clothing in which God is enclosed. The body encloses the soul. Matter encloses energy, and physicality encloses spirituality. So this is a huge, huge concept called enclosement. And we know that God's name is not mentioned in the Megillah, but God is enclosed in the events that are happening. And not only is God's name not mentioned in the Megillah, but Moshe's name is not mentioned in this parsha. It's the only parsha from the time that Moses is first introduced in the Torah to the end of the Torah, that his name does not appear in the Parsha. And those two things go together. That God's name is not mentioned in the Megillah, and Moshe's name is not mentioned in Tetzaveh, because their essence is enclosed in the events that are unfolding. So this is, like I said, this is not the main part of what I want to talk about today. But everyone, when you're hearing the story, keep in mind this idea of how much clothes take part in the story of the Megillah and what it means that the story is enclosing deep, deep concepts. And like we said, God is enclosed in the world. The soul is enclosed in the body. Energy is enclosed in matter, and spirituality is enclosed in physicality. So having said that, now let's go back to the idea of the clothing of the Kohanim and the high priest. So what I want to do is a very interesting idea, but it's going to lead us to very practical and deep ideas of the Jewish role in the world. And we're going to use a number. We're going to use a number, the number 72. First, I'm going to go back quickly, is that in the Parsha B'Shalach, when we're about to cross the Red Sea, the Egyptians are following us. We have our backs to the sea, and right before the miracle occurs and the sea splits, there are 3 verses in a row that have 72 letters. This is statistically, this is a very rare thing to have 3 verses in a row that have 72 letters. From this, we form what are called the 72 3-letter names of God. But the important thing here is 72 equals chesed. So these verses talk about how God separated the Egyptian camp from the Israeli camp and allowed Israel to cross through the sea. It was verses of protection, of God's chesed. And of course, the miracle was a huge act of chesed. But interestingly enough, these 3 verses that have 72 letters, 72 times 3 is 216, which equals Gvura. The opposite of, the seemingly opposite of chesed. So here we have 3 verses of 72 letters, and all the letters together equal 216. So you have chesed and gevura. In other words, the same act of saving the Jewish people, which was chesed to us, was gevura to the Egyptians. It was a heavy judgment, the same act. So keep that in mind. The next parsha is Parshat Yitro. This is where we receive the Torah on Sinai. And the parsha of Yitro has 72 verses. 72, again, equals chesed. The greatest chesed that God can do for the Jewish people is he gave us the Torah. He gave us the Torah until this day. This was a profound act of chesed from God. Now we come to this parsha, and we're going to see that the number 72 appears 4 different times in the clothing of especially the high priest. So where do we see this? So one of the clothing of the high priest was a breastplate. It was a square breastplate that he wore over his chest. And on it were 12 precious stones, 3 in each row, 4 rows, and 3 stones. On those stones were engraved the names of the 12 tribes. But there was a tradition that the number of letters on the breastplate, there's actually a disagreement in the Gvura how we come to this, but there are 50 letters in the tribes. But there was a tradition that there had to be 72 letters written on the breastplate. So how did we get from 50 letters for the 12 tribes to 72? So they added the names Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and Shivtei Yisrael, Shivtei Yeshurun, the tribes of Israel. Yeshurun is a name like Israel. It's like not a nickname, but it's a different term that we use for referring to the people of Israel as Yeshurun. Many synagogues are called Yeshurun because of that. So on the breastplate, there are 72 letters. Again, chesed. We're seeing God's loving kindness, God's giving, God's mercy all over the place. So inside the breastplate had a pocket. And in the pocket were what are called the Urim and Tumim. These were very, very mysterious. Sometimes in English, they were called oracles. Why? Is these Urim and Tumim inside of the breastplate that when very, very existential questions regarding all of Israel would be asked of the high priest. So in a mystical way that we don't 100% understand, the letters on the breastplate would begin to shine and would give the answer to the questions. This is a very mysterious thing, but it really happened. And the question is, what were these Urim v'Tumim? What were these oracles inside the breastplate? So one of the traditions is it was the Kabbalistic name of 72 letters of God's name, a special name of God that has 72 letters. Now remember, we had this concept of 72 three-letter names of God. And that's why we had to have 72 letters on the breastplate so that they would shine from the secret name of God in the pocket of the breastplate. So here we have already 2 appearances of this number 72 in the clothing of the high priest. Now there's 2 other appearances. One of the clothing of the high priest was a me'il, a cloak. Let's see what the best, like a robe that went all the ways down to the high priest's ankles. And the Torah says at the bottom on the seam were 72 bells and 72 pomegranates. Pomegranates made out of material. And there are 2 versions of how they were placed. One is they were placed bell, pomegranate, bell, pomegranate, bell, pomegranate, all the way around. So altogether there was 144 together, 72 pomegranates, 72 bells. The other opinion is that the bells were inside the pomegranates. The pomegranates were made out of material, but there was a bell attached to it. And the idea is when the Kohen Gadol would walk, these bells would ring. So here we have 4 appearances of the number 72. Now I want to go back and add one more thing, and then we'll discuss, well, what does this mean to us? We don't have these clothings today. We don't have a high priest. We don't have a temple. So what can I learn from this? So also we'll see in this parsha that the Kohen Gadol there were 2 stones, one on each shoulder. One on each shoulder. They were called the Shoham stones. And on one stone were written the names of 6 of the tribes, and on the other one, the other 6 tribes. So this is what we can learn from this, and it's a very, very profound idea, that the high priest represented all of the people of Israel, all Am Yisrael. And he had on his shoulders the names of the tribes, and on his chest, over his heart. So today, like I said, we don't have a Kohen Gadol. We have Kohanim, but we don't have a temple. We don't have the service. So what has replaced that service? The synagogue and our prayer services. And so it used to be that the Kohanim and the Kohen Gadol, they would do the service for all of Israel. The whole synagogue system came really towards the end of the Second Temple period. For almost 1,000 years between the tabernacle and the temple, the Kohanim were doing the service for all of Israel. Now, each and every one of us, through our prayers, performs the same service translated into our prayers and translated into the synagogue. The synagogue is a mirror image of the temple. The menorah is the eternal light. The ark is like the ark in the tabernacle. The place where we read the Torah, the bima is like the altar. We have all of the elements. The one leading the prayers is like the Kohen. But today, every single Jew does the whole service. So we all know the expression of having the whole world on our shoulders. You know that feeling? Having the whole world on our shoulders. But that's exactly the symbolism of these 2 stones, that the Kohen Gadol had on his shoulders the burden, but the privilege of representing all of Israel. And that's what each and every one of us has to see themselves as being a representative for all of Israel, and ultimately for the Torah, and ultimately for God. And this we learn from the clothing. And it's the same thing with the breastplate is on the high priest's heart. In other words, we have to hold in our hearts the destiny and the purpose of the entire Jewish people. Before we received the Torah, God told us that we would be a nation of priests and a holy nation. And this is what we have to learn from this today, because many, many people, when they come to these Torah portions about the tabernacle, are thinking, why do I have to know this? We don't have these clothings anymore. We don't have the different parts of the tabernacle. But each and every detail like we're doing here right now, every detail, every measurement, every material, every placement of everything in the tabernacle and the clothing teaches us something for today. And this idea of being a representative of all of Israel, each and every one of us, is an incredible, we have a bad connotation, we say burden. It's a responsibility and a privilege to carry all of Israel on our shoulders and carry all of Israel in our hearts. And ultimately, because we are meant to be a light unto the nations, we're carrying the whole world on our shoulders. And that is an incredible responsibility. That's what it means ultimately to be the chosen people, not a better people, but we're chosen with a certain purpose, a certain mission. And now I want to add this whole idea of 72 that we saw going back to crossing the Red Sea, of receiving the Torah at Sinai. And in this week's Parsha, the number 72 comes back over and over again. And again, 72 equals chesed, loving kindness. So when we're carrying all of Israel on our shoulders, when we're carrying all of Israel in our hearts, when we act in the world, when we speak, when we pray, we need to do it with chesed, with loving kindness. That's the message here. The message here is the Kohen Gadol was dressed in chesed. That was the clothing, was that he and we should manifest chesed in all of our actions. Sometimes we need Gvura, but even the Gvura can be with chesed. So this is a very, very beautiful understanding. And we're told that you can identify a Jew by three properties, three characteristics of a certain amount of humbleness, of acts of kindness, and through compassion. And it actually says in the Gemara that if you see someone, we're not talking about like a one-time thing, but if you see someone who's consistently acts with cruelty, the Gemara says you should question if they're really Jewish, because these qualities are at least supposed to be ideally ingrained so deeply in the Jewish people that it's what identifies us. And it's actually said that this is one of the reasons that we had to experience the slavery in Egypt, that we became a nation through being oppressed, so that we would learn how important it is to have compassion when we see other people being oppressed. It's a very, very important idea. So now I want to take one other idea. It's a little bit Kabbalistic, but we're gonna throw it in here. The Kohen Gadol, like we said, there are four different appearances of the number 72. Again, the 72 letters on the breastplate, the 72 letter name of God that were in the Urim V'Tumim, and the 72 pomegranates and the 72 bells. So I actually only thought of this today, and I thought it was just an amazing insight, and God somehow graced me with this insight, is if you multiply 72 times 4, so you get 288. The significance of 288 is when the Arizal explains his idea of we'll call it Torah cosmology. So he explains that before there was creation, before there was time or space or any world or creation, all that existed was the infinity of God, the infinite light of God. And the Arizal explains that where would God put a world? Where would God put a finite world if everything is infinite? So he explains the concept of what's called Tzimtzum, that God contracted, as it were, his infinite being to make space for a world. And then he shone a single light into the middle of the empty space. And from that, all creation comes. But the Ari explains that the initial lights of creation in the previous world that we call the world of Tohu, the world of chaos, the vessels were too immature to handle this incredible light, and they shattered. This is what many of you have heard is called the breaking of the vessels, Shvirat HaKelim. And all of this is to explain, the Arizal says very symbolically, when the vessels shattered, they shattered into 288 shards. So this number is very, very symbolic. And so we can understand in a deep way, and he called the previous world the world of Tohu, the world that shattered, the world of chaos. Not because the light was chaotic, it's because the vessels couldn't handle the light, and they shattered. And he explains that this world is called Olam HaTikun, the world of rectification, and it is made up of the broken pieces of a previous world. And that our mission is to bring rectification, healing, light, holiness into this world to heal the world, to rectify the world. That's why in the Aleinu prayer that we say 3 times a day, we say that we want to rectify the world, letaken ha'olam b'malchut shakai, to rectify the world in the kingdom of God. This is the mission of really humanity, and specifically the Jewish people. So I thought it very, very significant that the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, who is now all of us, we are all, in a sense, the high priest, and that his clothing is made up of 4 times 72, which is 288. And so therefore, it just hints, it's an allusion to our mission to be a light unto the nations, to try to bring healing, rectification, peace wherever we can. So I'll just end with a blessing that we could all manifest this, that we can manifest chesed, loving kindness, mercy, compassion, and we can truly be a light unto the nations. Okay. Just give me 1 second.